Welcome to today's Safety Connection and good morning. My name is Tony Volpato and I'm a specialized consultant in occupational hygiene at the Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. And I'm pleased to be your host and presenting with Christina St. Pierre this morning. So again, thank you for joining us for our session on the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development, or the MLITSD, Occupational Hygiene Campaigns for 2025 to 2026, which is a continuation of the same campaigns that started last year. And then to better understand who's participating in our Safety Connections and to ensure we're providing accessible training for all people in Ontario, we would like to invite you to participate in a short survey. We are collecting demographic information on behalf of our funder, the MLITSD. Your responses will be kept secure and anonymous, and the MLITSD will not receive any of your personal information. The WSPS will be analyzing the survey results in aggregate form prior to sending them to the MLITSD. Of course, completing the survey or answering any of the questions is optional. And to access the survey, please click the link on the screen, or you can scan the QR code with your phone or electronic device. The 6-digit function number to start the survey is here on the screen, which is the 229796. And thank you for taking the time to complete the survey and helping to make health and safety training accessible for all. Before we get started, I'd like to review some housekeeping items with you. So firstly, we recommend you use your computer audio with headphones, but phone conference audio is available. The phone conference audio details can be found in the access email you received. Your camera and microphone will remain off for the remainder of the session. We appreciate your participation throughout the webinar, and thanks for starting already by connecting in the chat. So within this meeting, you have the option also to use reactions, which are accessed in the menu bar. And reactions are instant and they float up the screen. Oh, wonderful. I see people starting to use them already. That's great. Thank you. We will be also asking a couple of poll questions throughout the webinar, which will pop up on your screen. And then please select your answer and then select Submit to participate in the poll. Dependent on your organization's security, you may not be able to interact with the poll question. If you determine this is the case, please use the chat to answer the question. And the meeting chat is accessed in the menu bar across the top, which I think we've all discovered already. We invite you all to put your questions in the chat as we've seen, and we'll be leaving time at the end as well for all the questions. And we will do our best to get to all of them. So when you think of them, you can put them in the chat or save them to the end. If we happen to run out of time, please email us directly afterward because we want to make sure that we answer all of your questions. Microsoft Teams offers 2 accessibility features, which may be of use as well. To enable the live captions, you select More from the menu bar, Language and Speech, and then turn on live captions. To enable the full screen mode, you can select View from the menu bar, More Options, and then Full Screen. Both features can be disabled by following the same instructions. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, please send a message in the meeting chat or respond to the access email you received. We have technical people tuning in as well that can offer support if needed. Our Safety Connection program has 4 main goals: to learn and share and discover what is of value to you, our customers, and our community, to connect virtually with our industry peers, to facilitate a best practice exchange, and to provide an opportunity to attend a health and safety webinar from your personal workspace. And now it's time to meet our speakers. We're pleased to have Christina St. Pierre with us this morning. Christina is the provincial hygienist at the Ministry of Labour, Immigration Training and Skills Development. She leads the group of occupational hygienists within the ministry responsible for the enforcement of the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations. She joined the ministry in 2013 as a hygienist, as a hygiene consultant, and became the provincial hygienist in 2022. Prior to joining the ministry, Christina was an occupational hygienist with the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board. She started her career in the nuclear industry and also has experience in private consulting and performing occupational hygiene surveys and laboratory analysis. Christina has a Master's of Engineering degree in occupational hygiene from the University of Toronto. She has been a certified industrial hygienist for over 20 years. And welcome, Christina. I will also be speaking after Christina to offer support on how to comply with potential orders that may be given by the MLITSD. I joined WSPS over 25 years ago as a health and safety consultant, providing a variety of health and safety services, such as conducting hazard assessments and facilitating training on a variety of health and safety topics, such as the certification training for Joint Health and Safety Committees and WHMIS. In 2019, I was very excited to earn the Certified Industrial Hygienist designation and currently provide occupational hygiene services such as noise and chemical exposure assessments, respirator fit testing, and respiratory protection program development, to name a few. I also received my master's degree, but in health sciences from the University of Toronto. Our agenda today. Christina will begin by providing an overview of the ministry's occupational hygiene campaigns for this year and provide some examples of what to expect during an inspection for both of the campaigns. I will then follow up with describing how you can comply with potential orders from the ministry and resources to help you prepare so that you're in good shape if the ministry inspectors arrive at your workplace. And most importantly, I will describe what you can do to ensure you are taking all reasonable actions to prevent worker exposure to hazardous materials in your workplace and ultimately prevent occupational illness and injuries for your workers. I'm sure no one wants anyone to get hurt or develop an illness because of an exposure to harmful chemicals at your workplace. So thank you for tuning in today and doing your best to prevent those potential injuries and illnesses. Please note that Christina will not answer any questions related to any ongoing investigations specific to orders that you may have received or any ongoing ministry visit. For specific questions, connect with your inspector or call the ministry's Health and Safety Contact Center. And before jumping in, let's get to know you a bit better first with our first poll question. So our first question to you is, what industry do you work in? And you should see it pop up on your screen. And then you just have to click which applies to you and click submit. So I see them coming in the chat there. We've got over 40% from the manufacturing, agriculture, service, and quite a few in other. So others, I see people are putting some of their responses in the chat as well. If you're an other, let us know in the chat. Construction, manufacturing, education, municipal government, there's live entertainment, education. Wow, lots of variety here. So again, thank you for tuning in today with us. And with that, we'll close the first poll and I pass it over to Christina.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. As Tony stated, that I'm here to present our hygiene campaigns for 2025-2026. And she had also already mentioned that we are continuing our campaigns that we started last fiscal. So for those of you who attended this session a year ago, the first part of my presentation is going to be very familiar because I recycled my slides and I'm doing the exact same presentation, at least for the first part, that I did last year. So it's just going to be a review for some of you, and for those of you who did not participate last year, it will be some new information. So just a bit of a disclaimer here that this presentation has been prepared to assist workplace parties in understanding their obligations under the Act and its regulations. And it does not constitute legal advice. So to determine your rights and responsibilities under the Act, please contact your legal counsel or refer to the legislation. Within the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development, I work in the Fair, Safe and Healthy Workplaces Division, where our vision is to make Ontario the most attractive place to work in the world because every employee is treated fairly and comes home safely. And we do this by setting, communicating, and enforcing legislation to help make Ontario workplaces fair, safe, and healthy. Okay, so, as occupational hygienists, the primary goal of our profession is really to prevent the occurrence of occupational illnesses. And occupational illnesses may result from short-term or acute and chronic or long-term exposures to hazardous chemical agents in the workplace. And we believe that controlling these exposures will help lower the risk of workers developing an occupational illness. And again, we have two hygiene campaigns for 2025-2026, which I will go over in more detail in the next few slides. And they are worker exposures to chemical agents in the workplace and WHMIS training based on the amended hazardous products regulations. So for the first campaign on worker exposures to chemical agents in the workplace, this is essentially enforcement of Regulation 833, which is the control of exposure to biological or chemical agents. And this campaign will apply in all workplaces where this regulation applies. So we're not going specifically to any specific workplace. It will really be any workplace where there are hazardous chemical agents that workers may be working with. And more specifically, our hygienists and inspectors will ensure that workers are not exposed to hazardous substances exceeding the occupational exposure limits. So Reg 833 prescribes the occupational exposure limits for different substances, and the primary goal of this campaign is to make sure that workers are not exceeding those exposure limits. And to do that, we're going to assess worker exposures by determining or identifying the hazards. So what are they exposed to? How are they exposed to it? And what is the level of exposure? And we'll also be doing that by observing the work practices. How are they working with it? And also evaluating the effectiveness of controls. And controls will be things like ventilation, personal and protective equipment. And we're also going to be checking to see if the workplace had done some exposure monitoring, so air sampling. And if they have, we will be reviewing that data. Or in some cases where it hasn't been done, we may also issue a requirement for the workplace to do air sampling. And any exposure data that we collect from this campaign will contribute to the development of an exposure surveillance system, which is a project that is being led by our prevention division. And the purpose of that is to collect exposure data for different workers at different workplaces for different tasks to kind of give the information to really anybody about potential exposures that they could encounter depending on their occupation and the type of workplace that they work in. In terms of timing, there's usually two phases to our campaign. So there's the education and outreach phase, which is what I'm doing right now, promoting the campaigns. And then there's enforcement phase that consists of the active inspections. For this campaign, actually for both campaigns, the phase 1 and phase 2 timelines overlap. They're essentially happening throughout the entire fiscal year. So the inspections had already started, but again, they were a continuation of last year, so it shouldn't be anything new for most workplaces anyway. So again, the promotion part of it is what I'm doing right now. We're working with our health and safety associations to do that. So for this one, we're working with WSPS, but we're also working with IHSA, PSHSA, and WSN. For the enforcement part, like I mentioned earlier, we're really going to any workplace where this campaign may apply. So it could be in the industrial, mining, healthcare, or construction sectors. For our second campaign, it's on WHMIS training based on the amended hazardous products regulations. So for this one, it's essentially ensuring compliance with a WHMIS regulation or Regulation 860, again, in all workplaces where this regulation applies and where there are hazardous products that workers work with or may be exposed to. And more specifically, we're going to determine if retraining on WHMIS will be required depending on whether the hazardous products in the workplace have labels and safety data sheets that are compliant with the amended hazardous products regulations or the HPR. So that's quite a mouthful. There's a lot to unpack there, but I will do that when I present the example for this campaign later on in this presentation. In terms of timing, it's similar to our other campaign. It's also taking place for the entire fiscal year for both the education and outreach and the enforcement or inspection part of it. And again, we're going to be going to any workplace where there are hazardous products in all sectors such as mining, healthcare, construction, industrial, and others. Okay, so I'm not going to spend most of my time on a couple of examples of inspections under these campaigns. So I'm going to describe exactly what happens in a typical inspection that we will conduct under these campaigns. I do want to say, though, that this is not an all-inclusive description of an inspection. If you were lucky enough to have been inspected by the Ministry of Labor at some point, you will realize that there are different experiences depending on your circumstances. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm really only going to describe a typical inspection that will be occurring under these campaigns. So focusing on these things and not necessarily covering everything that could happen in an inspection. So in a typical inspection, proactive inspection in this case for campaigns, we usually show up unannounced. And because really this is an audit, so we really want to see what the conditions are on a typical day. And it could either, for these campaigns, either an occupational health and safety inspector and or an occupational hygienist will be conducting it. So it could be two of them or it could just be one of them. And they would arrive at the workplace, introduce themselves, and indicate the purpose of their visit, which in this case will be ensuring compliance with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations, with the focus on the campaign, which is worker exposures to chemical agents for this example. We would also ask to meet with employer and worker representatives. So we would usually ask who their health and safety representative is, or who is in charge of health and safety, or in smaller workplaces, we would just ask who is in charge of the workplace. And then we would also make sure that there is representation from the workers, so either a health and safety worker representative for smaller employers, or a worker member of the Joint Health and Safety Committee for the larger employers. And then we would have a preliminary discussion of workplace and operations and gather some information initially before we go out into the production floor. And we would typically do that in a boardroom or some quiet area within the workplace. So for that initial discussion, these are some of the things that we would be talking about. And for the purpose of this example, I'm going to assume it's a manufacturing facility and that we're going to focus on just one task within that facility, and it would be the spray painting, in this case of small parts inside an open face booth. So let me back up a bit. So we would sit down and explain again that we are there for the campaign, and we would explain what the campaign is all about, which is what I had described earlier. So we're focusing on worker exposures to chemical agents in the workplace. And then we would ask, what does the company do? What do your workers do? What are your operations? What equipment are you using? What materials are involved in those processes? And then again, for this particular inspection, we're focusing on spray painting small parts inside an open face booth. We would then ask more details about the work task. So how many workers are involved in painting? And how often are they doing it? How long are they doing it for? And how much of the materials are they using? And what materials are they using? So let's say for this particular workplace, the employer says there are about 2 or 3 workers doing spray painting at a time. It's intermittent. It depends on production demands. And it's roughly about 2 to 4 hours a day, 3 times a week. And then then we'll say okay, and then we'll ask for what chemicals or what products they're using when they're doing spray painting. And this is when we would typically ask for their safety data sheets, because that would give us most of the information that we will need. So most of the time, we're given a very thick dirty binder of SDSs to flip through, which is okay. And say, let's say for this particular example, that as we're flipping through the binder, we find that the main components of the paints that they're using are toluene, xylene, methyl ethyl ketone, and acetone. And then once we take into account the main chemicals of concern, we would then ask the employer, have you done air sampling before? Have you tried to quantify what the workers are exposed to? And let's say for this particular example that they have not done any air sampling. If they have done air sampling, we would ask a copy of that report for us to either review on site or take it back with us and review off site, and then provide feedback to the employer after we review it. And depending on what's in that report, there may not be enforcement actions that will come out of that. And then we would also ask them about what controls they have in place. So just describe, what does the paint booth look like? Presumably it's got ventilation associated with it. And are the workers wearing any personal protective equipment like respirators, coveralls, or gloves? And if they are, what kind of respirators, what kind of cartridges, what types of materials for the coveralls and the gloves? And then we would also ask for records of training. So because they're working with hazardous products, we would require them to have done WHMIS training. So we would ask for training records for WHMIS. And we would also, if they are wearing respirators, we would also ask for the respiratory protection program, which should include fit testing and training. And then because it's a paint booth with ventilation, we may also ask them for preventative maintenance records on the ventilation system for the paint booth. And once we've done that initial discussion, we would then do a walkthrough of the workplace itself. So that's when we would focus on the paint booth, just for the sake of this example, and look at it as a whole. So we are not just looking at the paint booth itself, but we're also going to look at what else is around the paint booth that could be affecting worker exposures that inside the paint booth. So we're going to be generally looking at general ventilation, and then the paint booth itself, we're going to be looking at the exhaust part of the booth. So for this example, I think we mentioned it's an open face, so one side of it is wide open. So presumably the exhaust would be at the other end of the booth. So we would look to see, is it working? And how are the filters looking? So our hygienists are also equipped with direct reading instruments that we can use to measure a bunch of different things. So in this particular situation, we have air velocity meters that we can use to measure the face velocity of the paint booth. And we would use something like the ACJH ventilation manual as a guide to determine if there's adequate airflow through the booth. In some cases, we might also use smoke tubes. So it's just a little device that puffs a bunch of smoke that we can use to kind of visually observe the air patterns within the booth. We're just trying to get an idea of how well the ventilation in the booth is working. We would also check to see if there's, in some booths, we'll have like a pressure gauge that will notify the preventative or the maintenance personnel when it's time to replace the filters. And speaking of the filters, we would also look at the filters themselves to see how dirty they are, and we would ask questions like, how often do you replace the filters, and when do you know when it's time to replace the filters? And then if they're spray painting, we may also ask, is it interlocked with the ventilation system such that they can't use the spray guns if the ventilation is not running? So those are some of the questions we would ask around the ventilation of the booth. And then we'd also observe the worker themselves. So how are they doing their work? How are they positioning themselves relative to the exhaust? Because some of them might actually be blocking the exhaust, essentially rendering the ventilation ineffective, because they're essentially breathing all the organic vapors first before they're being exhausted. So we're going to look for things like that, and we're also going to look at what they're wearing. So are they wearing respirators? Are they wearing coveralls and gloves, and what condition are those personal protective equipment are in? And then if they're wearing respirators, we'll also look to see how are they wearing them? Do they have facial hair? Where are they storing them when they're not using them? And we'll just ask them general questions about how they put on the respirator and take them off. We'll also check to see that the respirator is appropriate for this type of operation. So in this case, we're looking at organic vapor cartridges. So if they're wearing N95 respirators, that's not appropriate. So that's something that we would check for as well. Let me just make sure I covered everything here. And yes, we'd also look at to see where they're storing their chemical products, because most of these are volatile, and just making sure that they're being stored properly. Okay, and then at the end of the walkthrough, we would have a discussion with the workplace parties, and this is just a short list of some of the orders that may result from this inspection, depending on what we find. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to be looking for some air sampling data, and if we don't have air sampling data and we're not quite 100% sure what the exposure could be like, we may issue a 54(1)(f) requirement under the Act for the employer to do air sampling. And in this case, it's usually a personal air sample that we're looking for. And for the purpose of this example, it will be for toluene, xylene, methyl ethyl ketone, and acetone, which are the primary components of the chemicals that they're using. We do have within the ministry a limited budget to do air sampling for workplaces, and we typically do this for smaller workplaces who don't have the resources to do it. So we may offer that to do that for them. And when it comes to the respiratory protection program, there's a whole bunch of sections that apply in Reg 833, including things like having a written respiratory protection program, training, fit testing, making sure that it's a NIOSH approved or equivalent respirator, and making sure that there's no facial hair. So those are some of the things we would look for respiratory protection. I missed one here for the occupational exposure limit. So if in our initial assessment, we determine that there is a high probability, or we have confirmed that the workers are in fact overexposed to some of these components, we may also issue an order under Reg 833 Section 4.1, which is to ensure that the employer take measures to make sure that the workers are not exposed above the occupational exposure limits for these substances. When it comes to the paint booth itself, if it's not working properly and the filters don't look too great, then we may also issue a 25(1)(b) to order under the Act to maintain the paint booth ventilation in good condition. So again, these are just some of the orders that we may be issuing that we will discuss with workplace parties at the end of the inspection. And at that point, we would conclude the inspection and we would write the report either at the workplace if they have a spot for us, or off-site at our other office, in other words, at Tim Hortons. And then we would write the report and come back to the workplace and present it to them. And the report is supposed to be posted for everybody to see. And then at some point in time, we will follow up with the employer to make sure that they've complied with any orders or requirements that we've issued. So that's in a nutshell what an inspection would look like under this campaign. For the second campaign, a similar thing. I'm not going to go over the same everything in the same detail, but it essentially goes through the same process. So we would attend unannounced, and we would introduce ourselves, ask for the employer and worker rep, and have an initial discussion in the boardroom to just get some preliminary information. For this one, we're going to say that we're focusing on the WHMIS training enforcement based on the amended HPR, and my next slide will describe exactly what that means. And let's say for this example, it's a furniture manufacturer that does woodworking, assembly of sofas, chairs, stools, and benches. So we would ask the same types of questions. You know, what does your company do? What do your workers do? What tasks do they do? And what is the process? What's the equipment and the materials that you're using? For this one, let's say that they're using an adhesive that contains methylene chloride. So again, because even though this campaign is focused on WHMIS, we would still go through the same line of questioning that we did for the other campaign, because we still want to make sure that the workers are protected against exposure to methylene chloride. So we would ask the same questions like, how are they working with it? Or what controls are in place? Ventilation, personal protective equipment. Have they been trained? If they're wearing respirators, do they have everything that's required with wearing respirators? Has there been air sampling done? And things like that. So similar type of questioning. But again, we're focusing on WHMIS, so we would also ask for their safety data sheets and training as well for WHMIS training. So let's say for this particular workplace, they do generic online WHMIS training, which they do upon hire and annually thereafter, which is okay, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. Okay, so when it comes to this campaign, I just wanted to explain what it's all about and why we're doing this. So WHMIS enforcement is actually two parts. There's the federal part of it, and then there's the provincial part. And the federal part, it involves the Hazardous Products Act and the Hazardous Products Regulations, which is administered by Health Canada. And the HPA, or Hazardous Products Act, specifies the responsibilities of suppliers of hazardous products. So it essentially requires suppliers to provide the SDSs and make sure that the products are labeled properly. And when I say suppliers, they're manufacturers, distributors, and importers of hazardous products. The HPR, or Hazardous Products Regulations, specifies the requirements or the information that needs to be on the labels and SDS. So it's very prescriptive. It tells you exactly what needs to be in the SDS and labels, and also how to classify the products depending on the properties of the ingredients. Now, the changes happened on the HPR, and this took place in December of 2022. There were changes that involved changes in hazard classification and some of the information elements that are required in the SDS. But the suppliers were given a 3-year transition period, which actually ends in December of this year. So they were given 3 years to comply, during which time some of the SDSs had already been updated, while others have remained the same, which is okay during the transition period. But that is why we're doing this campaign to determine if the SDSs had already been changed to comply with the amended HPR, then WHMIS training will need to be redone to make sure that workers are aware of the changes in the SDS and the labels. Now, WHMIS training, the frequency of WHMIS training is not prescribed. However, the employer or the workplace parties have to demonstrate knowledge transfer, and things like this, when there are changes in the requirement and the information in the SDS and labels, would trigger a retraining on WHMIS to make sure that everybody's aware of the changes. So that's essentially what this campaign is all about. So once the changes in the SDS had happened, then we would require the employer to retrain the workers on WHMIS. Okay, so going back to our example, so after initial discussion, we would do a walkthrough, same thing that we did with the paint booth. So in this case, we would focus on the tasks that involve methylene chloride. And again, we'd look at the same things like ventilation controls, administrative controls, work practices, personal protective equipment, and ask questions along those lines. But we would also look at containers of the hazardous products. So a lot of times they would decant the products from the original container into smaller containers. So we will look to make sure that those smaller containers have workplace labels. And we would also talk to the workers and ask them, what are you doing? How are you doing these things? And how are you handling the chemicals? So let's say for this one, they're spraying the adhesive and it's intermittent and it's only for a few minutes at a time, several times during the day. And maybe they may not have ventilation. They may not be doing this under a hood of some sort, but that's also something that we would consider when we're assessing worker exposures. But then we would also talk to them about WHMIS. So we might see a container of a hazardous product there, and we might point to it and ask them, okay, what can you tell me about this substance? You see these symbols here, what do they mean? Now, we don't expect everybody to remember everything that they've learned in WHMIS, but they should have a general understanding of what the symbols mean. And that's what we're looking for when we're having those conversations with workers. And then again, if they've decanted the products, we're going to make sure that they're properly labeled and yeah, evaluate exposures as well, as I had mentioned earlier. And after that walkthrough, we then consider some of the orders. And this is, again, not a complete list of orders that we may be issuing, but a lot of them are related to WHMIS training, SDSs, and labeling. So 17.1, Section 17.1 of Reg 860 is for supplier safety data sheets. If the safety data sheets or the SDSs are not available at the workplace, then that is an order that we would issue. We do not necessarily require SDSs to be in paper form. They can be in electronic form as long as if they're accessible to workers, and if they're online, that there's a contingency plan in case of a power failure, for example. So not necessarily paper, electronic's fine as long as it's accessible and there's a backup plan. For training, 7.1 would apply here. So again, as I mentioned earlier, if they already have SDSs with changes on them, they would need to redo WHMIS training, and it'll be under Section 7.1 to make sure that the workers understand the contents of the labels and the safety data sheets, focusing on the changes that were made in those in the SES and labels. And then let's say for this particular example that the SDSs for methylene chloride at this workplace had already been changed to be compliant with amended HBR, and that their most recent WMIS training had not reflected those changes. So in this case, an order under 7.1 will be issued. Other orders in Reg 860 would be for supplier labels. So if we see containers that have not been labeled properly, we would then issue an order for that. And then for the decanted products, we're looking for workplace labels. And workplace labels are not just scribbling of the name of the product on the container. It actually requires 3 components to it. The name of the product that is identical to the name of the product on the SES, some information on the safe handling of the product, and also a reference to the safety data sheet, making sure that it's available. Okay, so I guess that concludes my part of the presentation. But yes, so for the WMIS, just to wrap it up, for the WMIS campaign, it will end the same way as the other campaign, as with any of our inspections. At the end of the inspection, we will have a debrief, talk about possible orders and requirements, and we would write a report, present it to the workplace, and follow up for compliance later on. And that's it for me at this time. Thank you. And Tony, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Those were great examples. Really appreciate that. And I thought I would just start quickly by sharing WSPS's vision as well. And that is protecting the potential of Ontario businesses and employees by keeping every worker healthy and safe every day. So that is our vision at WSPS, like all of you, I'm sure. So the first order that Christina mentioned under the campaigns regarding the worker exposure to chemical agents in the workplace is highlighted here. And it is under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Section 54(1)(f), the requirement to conduct air sampling for toluene, xylene, methyl ethyl ketone, and acetone. So my plan for the rest of the webinar is to highlight each order that Christina has provided and then provide further explanation of what is written in the legislation under that section and then how to comply with that order. So you can see the order is specific here regarding which chemicals require air sampling, and they're listed there starting with toluene. So the orders often will be very specific. And here is what is written in the Act in Section 54(1)(f) under the powers of inspector. So require in writing an employer to cause any tests described in Clause E to be conducted or taken at the expense of the employer by a person possessing such special expert or professional knowledge or qualifications as are specified by the inspector, and to provide at the expense of the employer a report or assessment by that person. And E says, conduct or take tests of any equipment, machine, device, article, thing, or material, or biological, chemical, or physical agent in or about the workplace. For such purposes, take and carry away such samples as may be necessary. So you can see this is written right in the legislation that they can ask the employer to have this type of chemical agent assessment done, taking the test. So really talking about that air sampling test comes from this section. So what really do we mean when we say air sampling? We have an entire safety connection dedicated to this topic, which explains it in much more detail, and it's called air sampling, air assessments. And we have a recording on our website that you're welcome to watch, and we'll also be running it again in the next few months as well. So you're welcome to tune in, and there'll be a lot more detail. But I will highlight a few key points here to explain air sampling. You may also have heard air sampling called other things, such as an occupational hygiene chemical exposure assessment or an air exposure assessment, these are all similar terms used to describe really the same thing. So when we do this, we're actually collecting the air and measuring the amount of the hazardous product that's in the air that would be in the worker's breathing zone. So it would reflect what the worker would be breathing in on a typical day for the purpose of comparing the results of that air that gets collected on the sample media, compare the results to the occupational exposure limits for that hazardous product. Because you don't know what amount workers are exposed to, how much is in the air, until you actually measure it. Okay? So this process really helps ensure a safe work environment by determining if your current controls are sufficient or if additional controls are required to protect the worker's health. The results of the air sampling will also be used to determine the type of respirator that's needed. So depending on how high the levels are of that chemical, so for example, toluene, a half-face respirator might not be sufficient. If levels are really quite high, you may require a full-face respirator. And I'll explain how we determine that in a few slides. Our poll question number 2, has your organization conducted air sampling or occupational hygiene chemical exposure assessment in your workplace? So if you can click yes, no, or you're maybe not sure, and we'll see how the poll comes out. Oh, yes, wow, almost 70% have done this already. So that is fantastic. And because that is really what we want, right? People being proactive and knowing this ahead of time. And if you're not sure, that's okay too. That might be some homework for you to go back and talk to people and see if there's an exposure report that you weren't aware of, and have a look at it and see how relevant it still is today. Okay, so thank you. We can close the poll and we'll move on to our next slide here, talking about chemical exposure assessment strategy. So please, everyone, give me a thumbs up if you are familiar with this RACE approach used really to address, great, thank you. Really, this can be used to address any workplace hazard. And you definitely would have heard about this, this process in your JHSC training if you took that training. Great, thank you. Lots of thumbs up coming through. And if you're not familiar with it, that's okay. I'm going to highlight what we mean throughout the next few slides. So this really is a great process when addressing any health and safety hazard. And I will specifically, though, address it to exposure to hazardous chemicals in your workplace. So the first step is always to recognize or identify the potential for workers to be exposed to any hazardous chemicals in your workplace. And then the second step is then to assess it, which means evaluating really the extent of that exposure or the potential health impacts. So you need to ensure workers are not overexposed to the hazardous chemicals that have an occupational exposure limit. The third step is then controlling it. So you have to understand, what do you have? How bad is it? And we want to make sure we have adequate controls in place. So there's lots of ways you can control hazards, and we'll look at that hierarchy of controls again. And then the last step is evaluate, which means really this continuous monitoring process and really an assessment of your effectiveness of your controls. So you do a lot of work and you put a lot of energy into understanding the hazards and controlling them. And then evaluating is then just checking in. How did we do? Are we now sufficient? Have we maybe created new hazards that we didn't think of before? So I'll detail each of these steps in a bit more in the following slides. And you'll see that which step I'm in at the top of right-hand corner of the slides. So as I mentioned, the first step is identifying or recognizing any potential exposure to the hazardous chemicals in your workplace. So you're thinking about who could be exposed and what they be exposed to. To start out, you can start by talking to a variety of people, or many of you, I'm sure, have already done this, right? So connecting with your supervisors, your workers, the JHSC, and of course, your suppliers of your hazardous chemicals. And you really need to know what those chemicals are in your workplace and understand who could be exposed to them. And that can be done through a facility walkthrough, looking for and where are all these chemicals being stored, where are they being used, so you do have a good understanding. So thinking about, do you have a good chemical inventory? Is it up to date? Is it current? Right? Have we gotten rid of things? Have we had new things come in since this has been looked at? So that's kind of an ongoing continuous update that should be done for sure. And then once you have a good sense of, okay, here's all the chemicals we have, you want to look at those SDSs, making sure that you've got an up-to-date SDS. And then you're looking in section 3 and 8 will provide you details of what are the actual hazardous chemicals in that product. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But the SDS is really, I know they can be some are much better than others, and they can be a little overwhelming, but that is where you're hopefully going to find a lot of good information about the hazards of your products and how to handle them safely. And when you see what those hazardous products are in section 3, it starts out, they'll list, so example, there might be toluene listed in there. It may also tell you the exposure limit, or you need to go look it up yourself, and I'll show you how to do this as well. Every hazardous chemical has a CAS number, and it's the last bullet here. It stands for the Chemical Abstract Service Number, or CAS number. And that's how we look up those hazardous chemicals to find out what the OEL, or the occupational exposure limit, is. The second order Christina mentioned is under Regulation 833, Section 4, Subsection 1, to ensure that the occupational exposure limit is not exceeded. And she's given the example here of toluene as 20 parts per million for a time-weighted average. So in our section, in Regulation 833, Section 4, it states the employer's duties. They must limit the exposure of workers to a hazardous biological or chemical agent in accordance with the following rules. If the agent is listed in the Ontario table, exposure shall not exceed the TWA, STEL, or ceiling set out in the, whoops, I'm not sure what happened there, why that got changed. So I'm going to just quickly go back to the slide I was on. Sorry, everyone, that got clicked. In Regulation 833, we want to be really clear and say that what are the exposure limits, and then people cannot be overexposed to them. So in number 2 here, it mentions if the agent is not listed in the Ontario table, but is listed in the ACGIH table, exposure shall not exceed the TWA, STEL, or ceiling set out in the ACGIH table. And the ACGIH stands for the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, and it's a nonprofit scientific association that sets exposure limits for chemicals and other workplace hazards. And these limits are known as the threshold limit values and are used to guide workplace safety and industrial hygiene practices. And really the table, the Ontario table we have, and we must comply with here in Ontario, is based on the ACGIH limits set out in the year 2017. And it goes on to say, if that table does not have a STEL or a C, the exposure shall not exceed these excursion limits. So it's almost like a way of having a STEL. So 3 times the TWA for any period of 30 minutes, or 5 times that of a TWA. So those are like the ceiling or a STEL. So again, just to clarify, what do we mean by the TWA? It's a time-weighted average airborne concentration of a biological or chemical agent which a worker may be exposed to in the workday or work week. The short-term exposure limit is the maximum concentration they could be exposed to in a 15-minute period. So it's a much shorter time, so that's often a bit higher concentration. But that STEL should be no more than 4 times during an 8-hour shift and at least 1 hour between those high exposures. And the C or ceiling limit is the maximum concentration that the biological or chemical agent could be exposed to at any time. So that's a great word. I like it, ceiling. You must never go above that amount in the air. So how do you find out about what are those exposure limits? To find that out, you need to check online. The easiest way to go about it is on the ministry's website, and it's the current occupational exposure limits for Ontario workplaces under Regulation 833. And this link we will include in our resources, or you can do a search and it, I'm sure, will pop up for you as well. So when you look at this table, you go to that website, you look down and you are searching for the hazardous chemicals that you find in your SDS. So in that section 3 and 8. So it's going to list for you what are the hazardous products. And then you go to this website and you do the Control F functions so you can find it relatively quickly. And I always put in the CAS number. So you can see here, toluene, you could type in toluene, it may pop up. The problem is sometimes chemicals, the same chemical has different names. So it's easiest to put in the number because the CAS number is always true to what you're interested in. So you type in the CAS number and you'll see toluene will pop up. And as Christina mentioned, it has a TWA of 20 parts per million. This toluene does not have a short-term exposure limit or ceiling, and it doesn't have a skin notation, which some chemicals do, which means if it has a skin notation, it would say skin, and that would be a main source of exposure, and you want to be really pay attention to proper protective equipment so people don't get it on their skin. And then another chemical Christina mentioned was xylene. So we popped it in here as well, just to show you. Xylene has a TWA much higher, 100 parts per million, with a STEL of 150. So that's really what we do. When you're talking to a hygienist and you want to do air sampling, we need to really get looking at those SDSs. What are those hazardous chemicals and what are the exposure limits? So before we can start doing the actual air sampling, we need to answer a lot of questions to develop a good exposure monitoring strategy with the employer. And this is something the WSPS occupational hygienists do regularly when employers reach out to us to ask for assistance with doing this air sampling. Right, so we connect with you and we really need to get a good sense of, again, what are those main chemicals? We need to determine how to sample it because every chemical has a sampling method. So we look those up. We understand where and who would be potentially exposed and when is a good time to sample. Really understanding how long to samples because depending if it's a short-term exposure limit, that's a shorter sampling compared to the TWA, which is the full day 8-hour sampling. And what makes sense? How many samples do we need to capture and get a good sense of what are those potential exposures of what those people are doing in their day-to-day work? And just to give you a couple of pictures here of what people might look like when they get the air sampling done, we had our occupational hygienist, Jay Young, actually take these pictures before she went to do some air sampling. So you can see some of the strategy or the methodology requires the person to wear a pump. So here on her hip, you can see she's wearing this pump. And what it does is it just draws air through so that the air would collect on this cassette. And we place this close to the breathing zone. So that's what it's doing there. And then depending on what chemical, it may look slightly different. And some don't even require a pump. It's just a nice, easy little clip-on. So we always try to do our best to position this and get it comfortable so it doesn't interfere with the worker or their work process. So they can do their job just like they do every day. And they go and they do their job. And then at the end of the day, we collect that cassette and we send it off to the lab for it to be analyzed. And then those results come back and we compare it to the occupational exposure limit. So once we've got that information, we compare those results and put it into a report form for you. So here is an example of a table that you would find in your report. We start out by listing sort of the sampling number, and that would be a special number that's on the cassette for that person. And that way we can track who it was, who was wearing it that day, and we collect more information here on what they were doing that day, what the conditions were like, was it a typical day, what kind of PPE were they wearing. And you can see here the results of this one, hypothetically, came back for me at 12 ppm for toluene. So you can see we've got toluene here. It's measured in parts per million, and these were my specific results. So we always put the actual TWA at the bottom, and we get that from the exposure limit table I just showed you previously on the ministry's website. So we can see that 12 is definitely below the occupational limit, which is great, but it is not under 50%, which is a good best practice. So if it's still above 50%, we always recommend there's better controls, or keep working on that to let's bring it down under 50%. So give me a thumbs up if you've heard of the term hierarchy of controls. And we'll absolutely fantastic. These you again would have heard in your JHSC training. But if you start at the top, elimination is always the best. If you can eliminate or substitute your hazardous product with a less hazardous chemical, that's always the best way to go, because then you don't need to worry about the person breathing it in. You've gotten rid of it. But if you can't, the next step is then to move down the hierarchy of controls. Engineering is a great way if you have general ventilation. Is that enough? Do we need some type of paint booth like Christina mentioned, or local exhaust that you can put close to the breathing zone and making sure that it's being pulling the air away from the breathing zone. So again, it doesn't even reach the worker in the first place. Awareness or administrative controls, these are very important as well. And these are always things to include, such as written procedures, training, documenting that. So the worker is always very clear and they know how to work safely with those chemicals. And PPE is the last resort, as you can see at the bottom. But is very important as well if you need to, if all the other things are not getting the exposure limit down below the exposure limit. But don't also, respirator is important, but again, don't forget about the glasses, the skin. So you want to make sure you're protecting the worker entirely. So where can you find recommended controls? Absolutely dive into your SDS. And you can look in section 8 is really good. They talk about not only the exposure limits will be here, but potential engineering controls and personal protection in that section. So jumping into a chat question, I'm interested to see what chemical exposure controls are currently in your workplace. What have you found to be effective in controlling your chemical exposures? If you don't mind putting in the chat some good things that you have already implemented. Anybody has done that. Absolutely the spray booth with good engineering controls. Defining purchasing practices, only approved chemicals. I love it. Right, that's an excellent administrative control. Yeah, LEV, local exhaust ventilation, PPE. Excellent, you've got it. Lots of great ideas. The next order Christina mentioned was the need for a written respiratory protection program. And she also described what that looks like. So I'll go into just a little bit more detail. It's in section 9 that says the employer who provides a worker with a respirator shall establish written measures and procedures regarding the selection, care, use, and respirators. So you don't want to just give somebody a respirator, right? There's definitely a lot more to it. Section 7 states that employers shall protect workers from exposure to a hazardous biological or chemical agent without requiring them to wear and use a respirator, unless subsection 2 applies. So what does subsection 2 say? The employer shall provide and workers shall wear and use a respirator appropriate in the circumstance to protect the workers from an exposure to an agent if the substitution of the agent is not reasonable or not practical, and if engineering controls required by the regulations are non-existent or not obtainable, are not reasonable or practical to install or provide because of the duration or frequency of the exposure, or because of the nature of the process, operation, or work, or are rendered ineffective because of temporary breakdown of the controls, or are ineffective to prevent, control, or limit exposures because of an emergency. So essentially, this is saying, you need to try all of the other things before you use the PPE, and unless these things apply. All right, so definitely in some situations, you will need proper PPE. And then it continues to go on and say the employer who does provide the worker with a respirator shall comply with the requirements set out in sections 9 through 13. And we also have a recorded webinar entirely dedicated to building a good respiratory protection program. But here it shows you all the components of a good respiratory protection program. And we can help you develop this as well, something we do quite often for our clients too. Now, it also says in section 10 of the regulation, a respirator must meet the following requirements. Approved by NIOSH, or basically an equivalent to NIOSH, and it must meet or exceed the applicable assigned protection factor set out in Schedule 2. So I wanted to just quickly explain that because all respirators do not give the same protection. This is Schedule 2, which lists the types of respirators and its corresponding assigned protection factor. You can see the first two listed are both air purifying respirators. The first is a filtering face piece, which is like the common N95 disposable respirators that cover the nose and the mouth, and they protect against particulate matter like dust. The second is a reusable type that also covers the nose and mouth and are made of a more durable material. These ones use replaceable filters and cartridges, you connect on the ends, and they can protect against the broader range of hazards like gases, vapors, and particulates. You can see the first two both have the same assigned protection factor of 10. The next one moving down is a full face air purifying respirator, which has an APF of 50. And you can see the powered air purifying respirator half face has an APF of 50 as well. And then the full face powered air purifying respirator has an APF of 1,000. The higher the APF, the more protection it will offer. So how do you know which one you need? You need to compare your workplace air sampling results to the maximum use concentration. The maximum use concentration means the maximum concentration of an airborne biological or chemical agent that a respirator can be expected to protect a worker using the respirator from and determined by multiplying the assigned protection factor set out in Schedule 2 for the respirator by the occupational exposure limit, or the OEL, set out for the substance in the Ontario table. Okay, so that you have to multiply those two together to get the maximum use concentration. So showing you an example of toluene, you multiply the APF by the OEL. So the first respirator with the APF of 10 multiplied by the OEL of 20, you get 200. Right, so you need to compare your workplace air sampling results to the maximum use concentration. So if my result was 12, but I knew I wanted to be more protected, or say I was just over the 20 limit, say I was at 25. 25 is still under 200, so the half face type respirator would work. Right? However, if it was much higher than 200, you would know you would need more protection. So, for example, if results came back from the lab with a toluene concentration of 500 ppm, again, that half face is not enough protection. It's only good up to the 200, and you would need to have that full face, or even better, the air purifying respirator. The next order Christina mentioned is regarding the need for fit testing. And this is the section that talks about that, right? If you can do the qualitative or quantitative fit testing, and it also mentions that the worker shall conduct positive and negative pressure seal checks every time they use it. So that's them putting it on, making sure they have a good tight seal, and doing the positive and negative pressure testing to make sure there's no leaks. Right? And here is where they talk about the facial hair must not come between the seal of the face. And that would be written right in your RPP document, your Respiratory Protection Program document. And then lastly, she mentioned the maintain the booth ventilation in good condition. That is in the Act. So back to the Occupational Health Safety Act, and that's where it mentions the employer shall ensure that not only are these equipment and materials provided, they must also be maintained in good condition. And Christina mentioned that, is that working well? Are the filters being changed? And so the inspectors will have a good look at your equipment and if you're maintaining it properly. So after the employer has implemented all these controls, it's important to evaluate the effectiveness of those controls. So this could include doing another exposure monitoring to determine if those exposure limit exposures are now much lower, under 50% of the OEL, right? It's amazing. Even some small procedural changes can really reduce exposure levels, especially if you've got improved ventilation and you're putting people in the right position so it's pulling it away. And like Christina mentioned, you're not actually blocking the ventilation vents that might be happening. And now moving on to the second campaign around WHMIS. So I want to go through this real quickly to give a little explanation of the orders that she mentioned above. So the first one is now we're in Regulation 860, Section 17, Subsection 1, regarding the supplier safety data sheets. And this is what it says in the regulation. Right? An employer who receives a hazardous product from a supplier for usage, storage, or handling shall obtain a supplier safety data sheet. Right? So it's very basic. I think everybody knows they need to get those. But here's an extra note. The supplier has 180 days to revise the labels and 90 days to revise the SDSs when significant changes are made to the product. The supplier then needs to attach a cover page with that updated SDS and provide that to you, explaining the changes that were made. And as Christina mentioned, paper copies are always acceptable. However, an electronic copy may be sent as an attachment in an email, but simply sending a link to a website is not acceptable for that. Before we go, before working with hazardous chemicals, of course, you all know we need to read the SDSs to learn about the specific hazards of that chemical and how to work with it safely, right? And your generic WHMIS training, I think, does usually a pretty good job of that and reviewing the 16 sections of the SDSs. So I won't go into detail that but just a quick reminder, the SDSs do have a lot of good information. Highlighting, you start out by the name, and section 2 really explains well what those hazards are and potential health effects. And the hygienists always dive into section 3 for composition. What are those hazardous ingredients? First aid, firefighting measures, accidental release measures, how to handle and store, the exposure controls, again, in the personal protective equipment, that's going to be in section 9. Section 8, sorry. Section 9 talks about the physical and chemical properties and so on. Stability and reactivities in 10, toxicological information, and you can see on the table all the information that's in your SDS. Right. So again, your generic training will usually cover what is an SDS and what's in an SDS. But your workplace specific training needs to actually get out those SDSs and review them with your workers and actually talk about the chemicals you're handling and really highlight what the hazards are and how to handle them safely. And that goes along with your the second order here. You want to make sure your WHMIS training includes specific information and point out the changes when reviewing the labels and the SDS. So in Christina's example, the training did not reflect the changes in the labels and the SDSs. So here's the section 7, that talks specifically in Regulation 860 about really what to include in your WHMIS training. So you can see A and B really highlights the required contents to be reviewed of the labels. So when you go to do your training, actually get some samples, actually look at the labels and go through them and show and point out the significance of the information on the labels. And the same thing with the SDSs. Go through each section and really highlight that. So if there's been changes, that's your opportune time to really point those out to your workers. And the next section really gets to the specific training as well. The employer needs to give instruction on procedures for the safe use, storage, handling, and disposal of that hazardous product, right? So you need to have good procedures. So even to step back a second, do you have good procedures written on how to do this? And then make sure your workers are trained on it and you're comfortable, they've learned how to do and handle these things safely, right? Procedures also, if there's fugitive emissions, procedures on what to do in case of an emergency. All of those details need to be included in your training. And the types of labels, just real quick to remind you from your WHMIS training, you've got your supplier labels, your workplace labels, and those with laboratories that have laboratory labels. Supplier labels, again, these are what they look like, but in taking time in your workplace specific WHMIS training, going through each of these things so people know what they are. We don't have time today to run through them all, but again, a reminder, what does your workplace label look like? It's very prescriptive in the regulation that a workplace label has to have these 3 things written on it. the name, safe handling precautions, and you can see an example on what that might look like here, and the reference to your SDS. Everybody in your workplace needs to know where those are and really should have read them before they're handling the chemicals, right? They should be very familiar what the SDS says and where they are if they want to review them again. So when a workplace label is required, definitely people need to know this as part of their training. So it's when a product is made or used in the workplace, if it's decanted into another container, you need to put on the workplace label. If the supplier label is lost or unreadable, or if multi-users are using the chemical and they're not being used right away. But again, that would be information you are absolutely including in your WHMIS training. And then next, around potential orders highlighted in Section 8, subsection 1 for supplier labels. This is what it says in Regulation 860. Every employer shall ensure that every hazardous product not in a container or every container of a hazardous product received at a workplace from a supplier is labeled with a supplier label. No employer shall alter a supplier label on a container in which the hazardous product is received from the supplier while any of the hazardous products remain in the container. And if a label applied to the hazardous product or a container of the hazardous product becomes illegible or is removed, an employer shall replace the label with either a supplier label or a workplace label. So that's what it actually says there. And here, Christina highlighting Section 10, subsection 1 for workplace labels, needing the requirement for that. And this is what it says is a workplace label. So it is defined in Regulation 860 what a workplace label is, and it's really those three things. So again, part of your training in WHMIS is to talk about this when people need to make a workplace label and give them the exact information on how you would do that in your workplace. Where are the labels? Where's the pen? Where's the paper? Do we have stickies? You know, whatever it looks like in your workplace, make sure people understand that. And again, Section 10, subsection 1 is where it says a hazardous product that employer receives in a container from a supplier and as if it's transferred to another container, the employer shall ensure that other container has a workplace label. So during your specific training, like I mentioned, describe when to make the workplace label, how to do it, and evaluate if people are actually doing this. Right. So after every training session, you always want to make sure the knowledge has been transferred. You could do that with a quiz, or you can, observe them in the workplace actually doing what you want them to learn as well. So again, just highlighting for you, I spoke to these sections. So there's really a lot to talk about when you do your WHMIS training. And all of these specific details, you can refer back to the legislation and check to make sure you're covering these detailed information. And that's what this slide says too. Generic training, I think we're usually all pretty good with that. These are things that you can get maybe an hour, e-learning or a video. Generic training, you learn about the symbols. What do these pictograms mean? What is everybody's responsibilities? But that's not enough. I really want to just highlight the workplace specific training is really where the workers are going to learn about the chemicals they're handling and how to handle them safely, right? Having those good procedures written and people understand and then are trained how to handle them safely. And this is just a reminder. It says in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you need to actually review your WHMIS program on an annual basis with your committee. And the best way to do that is documenting it in your minutes. So just a quick word on how to do good workplace specific WHMIS training. You gather all your hazardous products, or you have a good sense of where they are. You make sure they're properly labeled. You get all your SDSs for your hazardous products. You're going to be checking, have they been updated, and making sure you're doing updated training if things have changed. Reviewing all the sections of each in the labels and the SDSs, highlighting that important information, and the specific procedures, safe work procedures for each of those hazardous chemicals. And you're showing workers how to make those workplace labels. And here are some thoughts on how to develop and train on those procedures for the safe use, storage, and handling of those procedures. I highly recommend you know, on an annual basis or as things change, you're going to update or first write and update those safe operating procedures. Have someone demonstrate how to work with that chemical, demonstrate that safe procedure. And then you as a supervisor would then watch and observe and make sure that person has learned and you see that they know how to do the job safely. And there's time for questions, there's time for them to practice. And you just repeat that process until you as a supervisor and the worker are now confident that they understand the procedure and they can do that independently on their own and are well protected. And as a supervisor, I now can sleep well at night because I know they have learned how to handle safely. And of course, document that review. That is perfect due diligence. Really good way to show you're doing everything reasonable to protect that worker. And these are just some things that you could ask your people at the end or doing spot checks. Like Christina said, you want to make sure people really understand these hazards and how to work and protect themselves. So some questions the ministry might be asking them. And definitely encourage reporting, right? Make sure part of your training includes telling them if anything goes wrong, we want to hear from you. So here's, you know, give them some samples of what you want to hear back from them. So just to end off, some tips for you to prepare for the WHMIS training campaign. Review your SDSs. Ensure you have an updated inventory with all your relevant SDSs in the workplace. And have they been updated to be in compliance with the HPR? If yes, you know you need to do your updated training with WHMIS, both generic and the workplace specific training, and review that program with your committee on an annual basis. These campaigns definitely overlap. So the other one with the worker exposure to chemical agents, same thing. You looking at all your SDSs, understanding what those hazardous chemicals ingredients are. Are there any occupational exposure limits we need to be aware of? And we need to make sure people are not being overexposed. Gather any previous exposure monitoring reports you have and understand the results. How long ago is it still relevant? Are we in good shape? Right? And determine if remonitoring is necessary. And absolutely discuss your monitoring strategy with your committee and a qualified occupational hygienist who's going to be doing the air sampling for you. And review those results and implement controls as necessary so that you are being proactive and you're ready to go if the ministry shows up, and you can be very proud and feel good that you have these controls in place and your workers are adequately protected. Some of our resources, we'll send you a link. We have a toolkit for our FAQ and how to read an SDS document and compliance checklists. A new thing we're trying this fall will be a free half-day work session to bring employers or people that are responsible for doing the in-house WHMIS-specific training. We're going to have a workshop to offer people to join in. So we'll be letting you know about that as well. But I want to get to our questions. I'm sorry we're running out of time, but we will send these links to you for all the pre-recorded Safety Connections and RPP resources. So thank you. And Christina, thank you for joining back on. And did you see questions?
Yeah, I've been actually monitoring the questions in the chat, and thank you so much for those who answered the questions. You guys are awesome because you got 99.9% of the answers correctly, and the ones that you didn't get correctly, other people corrected them as well. So I'm good with the answers in the chat. I just wanted to reinforce some of them. So if you could just bear with me for maybe the next few minutes, I can go over some of the answers grouped together. So then hopefully we can get through all of them. Okay, so women's first. I may not be able to answer the more recent questions, but okay, so as was mentioned earlier, women's training has to be site specific. So you can have the generic training, but it also needs to be specific to the chemicals that workers are working with at their workplace. And training can be internal, external, online, or in person. But ultimately, like Tony mentioned, we're looking for the knowledge transfer. We're making sure that the workers have that knowledge and they can identify the hazards that they're exposed to and they know what to do to protect themselves. The frequency of women's training is not prescribed. It's conducted as needed. And in this case, because there are changes in the SDS and labels, you will need to do the retraining at that time. SDSs do not expire. And it's a combined responsibility between the employer and the supplier to provide and obtain the SDS. So employers have the responsibility to have the SDSs. Suppliers have the responsibility to provide the SDSs. And the suppliers under the federal legislation will need to revise the SDSs when new information come in. And thank you for the link for sharing the links on the changes on the HPR in the chat. And they have 90 days to update SDSs and 180 days to update the labels when there are significant new changes in that information. And SDSs must be provided at every sale of the product. And as Tony mentioned, it can be electronic. It doesn't always have to be paper, but if it's electronic, it's got to be an attachment to an email, not a link to a website. I forgot to mention this, but MLITSD hygienists are also HPA inspectors. So we also enforce at the federal level, which means that we will also visit suppliers to make sure that they're providing the SDS and labels and they've got the correct information on those things. There was a question about the rebate program for the WSIB, and I'm sorry, I don't know the answer for that one. So I think I'm going to have to skip that one. Okay, switching gears to respirators. There's a whole bunch of questions on the respirators. Yes, N95 is a respirator. And thank you also for sharing the link for the facial hair and tight fitting respirators. We did put something on Ontario.ca recently on how to accommodate workers with facial hair that may not be able to shave because of religious reasons. So for that one, there's a clear definition of what constitutes a human right. And if that worker falls under that classification, so they don't have to shave their beard, then the employer has the duty to accommodate to a certain extent and within reason. And accommodation could be using a loose-fitting hood that doesn't require fit testing, or reassigning the worker to another job that doesn't require the use of a respirator. Well, face, yes, there's an inner cup to the full face, and the worker still needs to be clean shaven where that inner cup sits on the face. So that's it. Just because you have a beard doesn't mean a full face will be good enough. It still needs, the worker still needs to be clean shaven on that cup. And yes, thank you for sharing the duties of the worker and the supervisor in terms of providing the PPE and the workers for using the PPE. And if the worker uses the respirator voluntarily, or if the respirator is provided for voluntary use only, even though the OELs are not exceeded, as the regulation states that as soon as the employer provides the respirator, then everything that falls under the respiratory protection program will be required, which means written program, fit testing, training, and everything else. Now, if the worker brings their own respirator, technically the employer does not provide it. So that's kind of a tricky situation that will have to be discussed internally, because I'm not sure if the legislation will apply the same way for workers who are bringing their own respirators. But the onus really will be on the employer ultimately to make sure that their workers are safe. So even if they're bringing their own respirators, it's really a strong suggestion for them to make sure that workers are trained on the limitations of that respirator, especially if they're using them with facial hair. And check the manufacturer instructions for how frequently to change the cartridges and the filters. And there's also a question about what if they have a bunch of hazardous products, a bunch of SDSs, which one would they sample for? Then you would essentially pick the ones that are higher risk and the ones that are most likely for workers to be exposed to at a high level, and focus on those, because most likely once you control those, then you'll be controlling exposures to the other substances as well. Okay, I don't know if I covered everything, but I just summarized the answers that were provided. And again, thank you for
Great.
those. I'm just looking to see if there's other that were missed.
Thank you so much, Christina. I appreciate you looking through all of those, and I see we've hit 12 p.m. So if there's anything else you wanted to just quickly say, Christina, or wait, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, sorry, we didn't get to all the questions, but I hope that I touched on most of them. And again, thank you for everybody who came and thank you for everybody who participated. The question in the chat, again, thank you for providing the answers. You helped me out a great deal. And yeah, just thank you overall.
Great. Thank you again. So I know we could just talk for hours on this, so I'm sorry we need to end it, but thank you again. You have our emails and contact information, so please feel free to contact us. I know WSPS hygienists, we're all across Ontario. We're very happy to talk with anybody that has questions. If you didn't get your questions answered today, please email me and I'll make sure if I'm not sure, I'll reach out to Christina as well, and we'll get your answers to your questions. So thanks everyone. Thank you, Christina, and we'll see you again. Have a great afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.